In supply chain, there are a lot of different ways to think about the final mile. There's literally the path of some delivery person bringing a package to a person's house or a business's doorstep, but there's all of the legs in the journey that get closer and closer. Now, in some ways, that final mile can also be looked at in a human way. The drivers of the trucks each represent a final mile all their own. And because their job is so important, we, of course, have administration to go with it, the Commercial Driver's License Program. Now, there are a lot of benefits of earning a CDL. Job security, for one thing. They're really good jobs in terms of pay. They come with great benefits, especially among some of the different companies competing for drivers. And all of this goodness makes a CDL really valuable, but it also makes it subject to crime. So, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'll review some of the basics around getting a CDL and look at maybe what the pass fail rate is. How hard is it to get one? We'll look at some of the safety statistics associated with large trucks and their drivers. And then we'll consider some recent news stories that illustrate what can go wrong when the administration of CDLs is not handled properly or when drivers are not really qualified. So, first things first, when do you need a CDL to operate a vehicle? So, this is in the United States, but based on the standards here, if you are a driver who wants to operate across state lines in a vehicle that weighs more than 26,000 pounds, you need a CDL. Even if you don't happen to cross state lines, you still need that CDL if that vehicle, weighing more than 26,000 pounds, will be operated for commercial purposes. So there are three dimensions that come down to these guidelines. There's vehicle weight, there's operational geography, and there's commercial purpose. So we know the cutoff is 26,000 pounds. I'm going to be honest, I don't do great with how many Empire State Buildings and how many football fields and how many basketballs. What does that mean in context? So I looked this up to give you a frame of reference. The average Freightliner without a trailer attached to the back runs somewhere between 10 and 25,000 pounds. So in most cases, you're talking about literally just the cab, nothing at all behind it, already meeting that CDL requirement. With geography, we look at inside of or across state lines. So, certainly, if you're going to go across state lines, there's no doubt. But if you're staying inside of one state, then it comes down to commercial purpose. So, are you being paid to drive that truck? One of the loopholes to give you a sense of why these two things have to work together is, let's say I'm a mechanic and I'm repairing the truck and I want to test drive it. I don't necessarily need a CDL to test drive that truck. I probably have one, right? If that's my job, but it's not an absolute requirement because I'm not actually being paid to drive that truck to transport goods. I'm certainly staying inside of state lines. So there are a few little middle spaces that people can fall into. Now, to pass the test, it's a lot more extensive than a passenger car driver's license. There are three parts of the test, and all of these connect to the fact that you not only have to be capable of operating the truck, you have to know how it works and you have to be able to safely operate it in what can be sometimes crazy traffic conditions. So you have to be able to do a vehicle inspection, basically walking around, looking at the equipment, looking at the safety features, and making sure it's acceptable before you set out to put that truck on the road. There are basic operational skills you have to demonstrate. So for this, I actually think of it as being very close to a passenger driver's license, where maybe you're in a parking lot and you have to show you can back up. You have to show that you have general control over the vehicle. But then finally, you also have to pass a road driving test. You have to demonstrate that you have control of that vehicle safely and in accordance with the law in real traffic conditions. As an article that I read from FreightWaves explained, quote, undertrained drivers struggle with hours of service management, backing in tight urban docks, winter driving, trip time estimation, map reading, and defensive driving and mixed traffic. They went on to say weak standards allow paper drivers to emerge from fraudulent schools with documentation that looks legitimate but is not backed by competence. I think that concept of paper drivers is an excellent one. Operating a tractor trailer, an 18 wheeler, even just the cab without anything on the back, isn't something you can learn to do while reading a book. It's a matter of public safety. You need to know a little bit more about how that vehicle operates than most of us need to know about our passenger cars. But you also have to be trained and ready to remain compliant with all of the regulations that govern driving conditions, the number of hours you can be on the road, and making sure you're on time for your customers. So, how safe are these drivers? According to Geotab, there are about 4 million commercial truck drivers between the United States and Canada. The vast majority, 3.5 million or so out of that 4 million, operate in the United States. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, about 6,000 people a year die in accidents involving large trucks. Now, here's where it's interesting. We get some numbers where we can compare this to how our passenger car drivers are doing. Of those 6,000 accidents, only 3% involve elevated blood alcohol. Now, passenger drivers, we're not doing so great. About 25% of our car accidents involve elevated blood alcohol. On the truck driver's side, the primary causes of accidents involve distraction and drowsiness. And that goes back to that governance around how many hours can you operate safely before you need to take a break. Now, we started out by considering the fact that crossing state lines is one of the conditions for needing a CDL. So, who's in charge of deciding who gets a CDL and who does not? It's an interesting combination of federal and state or district level requirements. So, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation, has some very high level oversight. They set federal standards that are considered the bare minimum, and then states can build on that. But it's actually the states and the District of Washington, D.C. that issue those CDLs and assess driver qualifications based on their combination of federal requirements and state requirements. Now, part of offering or issuing a CDL is making sure that individual hasn't been disqualified in another jurisdiction and that they're not currently carrying a license in more than one jurisdiction. Any applicant has to pass 80% of the materials associated with being a driver to be considered a pass. Because the licenses are administered at the state level, it's really hard to find national statistics because everything is very averaged out. But just trying to get a ballpark, several estimates I found suggest that drivers are about 50-50 passing the test on the first try. It's an incredibly hard test. Now, it's not necessarily spelled out as part of the road test, but drivers do also have to prove that they are healthy enough to operate the truck. You don't want someone for any reason having a heart attack behind the wheel of one of these vehicles. Now, I mentioned earlier that a CDL is a very valuable thing to have, and that drivers have a 50-50 shot of passing the test on their first try. Generally speaking, you'll read in the news that this has led to a shortage of qualified drivers. But I love when somebody is willing to challenge something we all assume to be true. Rob Carpenter, writing for FreightWaves, denies that there's a driver shortage. He actually points out that there's not a driver shortage, there's a retention problem, with many LTL carriers seeing turnover rates in the 90% range. He also says that it's not a good idea to say there's a driver shortage just because we have too many trucks, but it is another way to look at the problem. So, what he's basically saying is that it's not that there's a shortage of drivers, it's just that there's so much competition, it's creating churn. Drivers are always looking for another place to go work, maybe where they can get better terms, better benefits, and better pay. Regardless, though, whether there is a shortage of drivers or a retention issue, the reality is that some companies can't find and keep drivers. And if you can't operate without drivers, you might be willing to do some pretty unscrupulous things to stay in business. Which brings us to the law and order portion of this episode. Now, I'm going to start, not with pride in this case, but it's the reality in Boston. We've recently had a major CDL related crime story in the headlines. Gary Cedarquist is a former sergeant with the Massachusetts State Police. He gave false passing scores on CDL road skill tests to 40 commercial driver's license applicants. Now, we know that licenses are issued at the state level. Each state gets to decide who's in charge of administering them. In Massachusetts, it's the state police. So this put Gary Cedarquist in a very powerful position relative to issuing these licenses. Now, if the national rough average is 50-50 passing the test, Massachusetts is not trending in the right direction. In 2019, the passage rate was 48%, so very close to that watered down national average. By 2020, it was 44. By 2021, it was 41%, and it stayed there in 2022. So we're approaching the 40% mark of getting drivers through the test. And yet, whether because of a shortage or whether because of churn, companies still need these drivers. So during roughly that same time frame, February of 2019 to January of 2023, Cedarquist and a few conspirators hatched a scheme. They used the code, quote, golden handshake, to identify people coming through the testing process who should be passed regardless of whether or not they did well on the test. In some cases, they didn't even have to take it. And this is officially conspiracy. There are multiple people and organizations involved with this. So Cedarquist is being looked as the ringleader, let's say. But he also conspired with a truck driving school in Brockton. He worked with them because the Mass State Police can't inspect the Mass State Police. And so that truck driving school was responsible for making the decision about which state police drivers deserved to earn their CDL. And they were just getting a pass through. Now, the more interesting or humorous example is a water company in the state who needed to employ drivers with CDLs. That company bribed Cedarquist to pass their drivers, and he accepted bribes for years. Now, given the value of a CDL and the fact that this is a shady business transaction, you would expect cash, maybe in an envelope, maybe stuffed in a secret location or passed underhanded. Nope, not in this case. In this case, the bribe consisted of bottled water, iced tea, other coffee and tea products, and then my personal favorites, Twizzlers and Swedish fish. I know this is serious, but I have to share an aside. I could take or leave the rest, but taking cases of free Swedish fish, I think that would test my morals too. Now, there's a whole record of text messages that go along with these deals, and a lot of those were admitted as evidence during the trial. Cedarquist is on the record in text describing some of these golden handshake applicants. He said things like, this applicant has an idiot who has no idea what he's doing and should have failed about 10 times already. Now, I should note that even in that specific case, Cedarquist passed him, even after saying those awful things about him. He described another applicant as horrible and brain dead, but gave him a passing score anyway in exchange for a $2,000 snowblower. As U.S. Attorney Leah Foley said, quote, his greed put the public at risk when he devised a scheme to issue commercial driver's licenses to applicants who had never taken a real test to operate heavy commercial vehicles on the roads and highways of Massachusetts. And the reality is, we know that having that CDL allows you to cross state lines. So it's not just about the safety in Massachusetts. It's a national safety problem. So in terms of the other people who participated in this conspiracy, some have already been sentenced. Eric Matheson, he was the source of the Swedish fish, for the record. He was sentenced on September 4th to 1 year and 1 day in prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. Now, part of why he's been sentenced so much more quickly, and some might say with a lighter sentence than he might have gotten, is because he pled guilty in March of this year. Cedarquist refused to do so, and he was convicted by a jury of his peers back in May and now awaits sentencing. He was supposed to be sentenced in late July, but has filed for a delay until late September or early October. I'm not sure his sentencing is going to be quite as lenient as Matheson's was. Now, I can joke about the CDL for Swedish fish exchange, but that's because the damage caused by these drivers, who did not deserve to be on the road, didn't have a chance to happen. Fortunately, these crimes and these fraudulently issued licenses were uncovered and pulled back. We tragically can't say the same about a driver in Florida. On August 12th, Harjinder Singh attempted an illegal U turn in an area marked for official use only, driving a tractor trailer. He blocked the entire highway and ended up killing 3 people in an oncoming car. Homeland Security has said that Singh obtained his commercial driver's license in California. But already in this story, we start to see playing out the different federal minimum and then state to state requirements for issuing and administering CDLs. So, a preliminary investigation done by the U.S. Department of Transportation found that Washington state had issued Singh a regular full term commercial driver's license back in July of 2023. Now, that is a type of license that people without legal status in the United States are not eligible for, and yet he was issued the license. A spokesperson for the Washington State Department of Licensing confirmed that that license was valid through July of 2024, when California issued him a commercial driver's license. That, in effect, canceled his Washington license. So, if you remember that information about issuing CDLs, you can't be prohibited from driving in another jurisdiction, and you can't carry a license in more than one state or district. So he somehow managed to get the Washington license, which, according to my reading, he should not have had, managed to go and apply for one in California. When California issued that license, it automatically canceled the Washington one. Unlike the state of Washington, California doesn't consider immigration status when awarding CDLs. So even if it canceled one that he already had, it was at least a license that, according to California state rules, he was permitted to have. Now, the questions that are following on is whether or not California and Washington should have issued that license. One of the things that I read came from Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. And in that article, it said, quote, authorities with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration said Singh failed an English proficiency test after the wreck, answering only 2 of 12 questions correctly. Singh correctly identified only 1 out of 4 highway traffic signs. So there are questions about whether his English literacy was tested as part of either test. Does it need to be? Is it part of the federal standards? It's not spelled out in terms of being able to walk around for the sake of equipment. It's not spelled out for the sake of being able to have basic control over the vehicle. Where that may come into play are the very specific details about being able to safely operate that vehicle on the road in traffic. If you can't read the traffic signs, by default, you cannot safely operate that vehicle. Now, this is a case where a program administered at the state level, in this case, most currently in California, that creates national problems. Singh didn't crash or kill people in California, where he was issued the CDL, but in Florida, who would not have awarded him a license to drive commercially because they do take immigration status into consideration. And the trouble doesn't stop there. Now, Series Trucking, the company that employed Singh at the time of the fatal crash, has also been subpoenaed. I have a feeling that all of the Swedish fish in the world would not be enough to let any of them wiggle their way out of this accountability. Even if it were, it would not bring back the three people who lost their lives driving on that highway in Florida. There are 3.5 million truck drivers operating in the United States. Making sure that they get credit for being essential, hardworking parts of the supply chain by ensuring only qualified individuals join their ranks is more than an administrative effort. It is a public safety concern that comes with real, tragic human costs when we aren't careful.